You know, you have more ancestral mothers than fathers. Mother, the same root word as material and matter, the very building blocks of reality. Once mother is done right, it's a picture of sacrifice. You know, so many times we end up in the arguments of men and logic versus women and emotions, but if the human race depended on logic to go on, we'd have had a very short run. You're facing 9 months of discomfort and all the roads out of pregnancy lead through pain. The longest labor on record was something like 75 days. And after all of that, you receive a tiny little crying human, totally dependent, that your emotions tell you is all worth it. And that's not even the end of the sacrifice, it's only the beginning. And I'm sure some mothers out there would say that's the easier part of it. On top of it, these little needy people can't communicate very well, so mothers have to be mind readers too. And then we were surprised when mothers are able to know what we're feeling without us even saying. They had to do it since you were born. To say thanks feels like too cheap a payment for such an immeasurable sacrifice. Happy Mother's Day. Breaking news, the deadly coronavirus has now been declared airborne. Sounds a lot more interesting than the American Center for Disease Control has changed the official categorization of COVID-19. Because that's really what it is. No new information has been learned. A year ago, scientists knew that the virus travels on aerosol particles. That's why the cloth mask especially doesn't work very well, and that's why indoors it tends to spread much more rapidly than outdoors, and why beaches and their open, hot sun, windy conditions aren't ideal for spreading of the virus also. But I'm sure just the official changing in categorization is going to shake up some people, and it tells a lot about human nature. It's like if you failed an exam and someone mistakenly gave you an A, and then they stop you to change your grade to an F. A lot of people would be more angry about the grade changing to an F than about failing the exam in the first place, or the very likely scenario of some people that are knowingly sick and sitting at home and they wouldn't go and get tested or any treatment, because if they go and they are reported to really be ill, then and then alone would it really be real. About coronavirus. It started in Wuhan, China. It did start from the bad coronaviruses. There's a lab in Wuhan, China that studies bad coronaviruses. Specifically, they were studying how to make it stronger through a type of research called gain-of-function research, a research that was banned in Obama's America. But as with most things banned in America means do it in China, so many American agencies were sponsoring the lab in China. The head of one of these funding organizations signed on to a letter to the public last year telling us that the virus did not come from the lab. And strangely enough, he was the only American scientist hired on to the World Health Organization team of investigators that went to Wuhan and investigated the lab under the watchful eye of the Chinese government. Their findings were that it was extremely unlikely that the lab leaked this virus. Now, in these facts, it's difficult to try and convince someone that researchers won't do shortcuts, or that the WHO is really good at investigating. But unless you have a lab and several epidemiologists, what choice do you have? You're already taking prescriptions that you can't even spell. Sometimes the choices aren't between good and bad, but between bad and worse, or between unknown and bad. A piece of land that was known to be the home of the Jews, but they weren't in charge for quite a while. It was in the hand of the Romans and then the Ottomans and eventually the British, who then gave it back to some Jews in the 1940s to create the nation of Israel. One of the many problems was that other people were already living there, the Palestinians, and add that to the fact that it was seen as the holy land for 3 major religions, so people are fighting over land and God. A few decades of conflict later, and some Israeli settlers are attempting to legally evict some Palestinians, but they believe it's their home, so protesters with stones meet riot police with stun grenades and rubber bullets. This eventually spills over into Hamas, an insult too far for Hamas, the terrorist organization in charge in Palestine, and they respond with a couple hundred rockets into Israel. But the Israelis believe in disproportionate retaliation, so you shoot them with a few hundred rockets and they're going to bring down your building. Did Israel hit a residential building with children, or was it a rocket launch site? Or maybe both. As with most modern conflicts, the information wars online seem just as real as the bombs and bullets, and with no shortage of human suffering on both sides to show in pictures, the propaganda wars continue. 650 new cases over a 24-hour period. That sounds pretty terrible. It sounds a little less terrible when you understand that it's actually from samples taken over a 5-day period. The information sounds kind of confusing, but it isn't to say that we're actually doing good. Our region, the Americas, had 1.2 million new COVID cases over the last week, and 40% of the global deaths came from our region. Trinidad, Guyana, St. Vincent, we aren't doing that well. If it wasn't so deadly, it would have been funny to see how, with every new bit of information that comes out, it seems to just convince people more of what they already believe. Okay, sometimes I wonder, maybe the Pope meeting with a famous rock star and a famous doctor doesn't convince you. But if you believe it's 5G or Bill Gates conspiracy, who convinced you of that? And what made them more convincing than anyone else? And why are you so afraid to be injected with a microchip that follows you around and tracks your data when you willingly carry one around in your pocket? X is around the corner and the pandemic doesn't want to leave the car. So thousands of Caribbean students are going to have to write this exam under these uniquely difficult circumstances. On top of that, a couple hundred of them have the added difficulty of having faced the volcanic eruption in St. Vincent and the after effects that affected the surrounding islands too. CXC says they're hearing though. They reduced the SB requirement in some subjects by up to 50%. Then 5 weeks before the exam, they released the topics they're going to test on for paper 2. The study advice I saw given after that release was concisely summarized in 2 words: study every day. Their final act of kindness was to offer students the option to defer their exam for a year, because obviously things are going to be back to normal by next year, and when an exam is the door to most further learning and a requirement for most jobs, delaying it by a year is going to lead to a lot of productivity. If you stop the exam, it's unfair to those who are ready now. If you reduce the difficulty, it's reducing the reward to those who have studied enough. But if you leave it as is, a lot of students are going to be disadvantaged when their only fault was their circumstance and the size of their parents' salary. Last year, I heard a lot of people begging for a state of emergency to really get this pandemic under control. But some people were asking against it, rights and all of that good stuff. But I wonder, what new rights are we going to lose to the state of emergency that haven't already been lost? So in that case, the SOE is really just an official name tag on the situation that we have already found ourselves in. And similarly with the curfew, who was even still out between 9 to 5 when everywhere is closed before 8? Well, maybe there was still some parties out and about, but I seem to recall in the last SOE that a lot of people were very willing to overnight in a venue to allow the party to go on. And if by now some people are still willing to host or go to a party, I doubt the idea of having to spend the night is going to scare them off. We're already running on essential staff, and they're essential because they're needed, and no one wants to see what would happen if they aren't doing their jobs. And we're close to finding out, with nearly 2,500 police having to be quarantined. There's only so much a government can do unless you're aiming for a government like China that will well people shut in their homes. Our system is supposed to be built on free people. Free people have rights, but they also have responsibilities.